Thank you, Mrs. McKinney. Mrs. McKinney, as you can see from her talk, has a rare faculty. She can command work from almost anybody that she approaches. People are very glad to work for her. She has the ability to make you want to get in there and pitch. Our next speaker has a difficult time in following up after that brilliant oration from Tom Anderson, but he's the man to do it. He comes from California, where he's a native son. Largest, most populous state in the Union now. He is a grandson of New Orleans forebears who were of French ancestry. He has a wife and 3 children. He is a one-time congressman who was elected as a conservative in California and who was a marked man immediately. I met him first at the Human Events Conference in Washington and heard him speak brilliantly, along with some other new conservatives. And the governor of California, Mr. Pat Brown, decided that he was far too formidable an adversary and far too dangerous, and that something had to be done. Well, they gerrymandered his district so that if you were to see a map of the district they gave him to run in the next time, it looked like an extended, elongated, damaged sausage. It made no rhyme, no reason. It was just simply drawn to defeat this man, and they succeeded. It was close, but it had to be that way. Now, instead of going home and retiring to his public relations firm or withdrawing because he'd been rejected, as other people have done, our speaker did nothing of the kind. He went right on fighting. He became the California coordinator of the John Birch Society. Next, because he was so able, he decided, or it was decided for him, to offer him a larger field, and he is now National Public Relations Director for the Society and also the official publisher of the Society's monthly magazine, American Opinion. So I give you a man who was not in the least put down by a very nasty political deal in his native state, who has a great future and who is a great speaker, John Rousselot.
Thank you, Mr. Garrity. I appreciate your thoughtful introduction. I just wish that more of our school carried more of your books. I think they'd be learning history the right way instead of the wrong way. My good friend Thomas Anderson, who I think it was one of the magazines we were both in once, referred to him as the John Birch Society's barefoot boy with cheek. I want to assure you, Tom, that I'm not here to open any can of peas today. And I want you to know that there are some conservatives at UCLA. I spoke there. That's the University of California at Los Angeles. We call it Moscow near Westwood. And I spoke to about not too long after you, I guess, to a group out there one afternoon. There were about 1,500 in attendance, and I think there were at least 25 conservatives there. So I want you to know we're making progress. Mrs. McKinney and Policeman Perkins and Daly, who've been nice enough to conceive the idea of this fine meeting. I'm pleased for many reasons to be here, not only because this is, of course, the cradle of our fine republic, at least a major portion of it, but also because it has produced these 3 people who have taken the initiative, as so many people do in the conservative movement. They don't wait for somebody else to do it. These three people just went ahead and decided it was time on 4th of July to talk about God, country, and family for a change instead of interdependence, as some of our leaders do. I'm pleased also to be here because this happens to be the home state of my wife, Marilyn. And, of course, she's now an avowed Californian. But she asked that her best wishes be extended and was sorry that she couldn't be with us today, and I am too. Now, I'm going to talk about a subject. I'm not here to give anything away today. You know, in our conservative movements, we don't give anything away at the door as you leave. All we ask you to do is take the information that you gather and do something about it. See that others use it and distribute it, and that we do something to awake more of our slumbering fellow citizens. Because as Robert Welch and others have said, if only 30 or 40% of our American people knew what was going on, we wouldn't even face half the problems that we have today. And so it's our job to leave this wonderful meeting this weekend and do something with the information, not just go home and sit on it, but see that our friends do something with it also. And so I'm going to talk about a subject that was extremely important to our founding fathers, used to be, and I think still is in many cases in many of our religious institutions, where we're supposed to learn about God, and in many of them we still do, but some unfortunately we don't. And that is the subject of civil rights. And I have given this talk several places in the country, I know, and some of you have probably heard it before, but I selected it because civil rights was a concept very important to the founding fathers of our country. And since we're talking about those concepts as they understood them and we've been able to make use of them, I thought it was important to talk about the communist betrayal of this very fine cause called civil rights, because that's exactly what the communists have tried to do, as they have so successfully done with so many other fine concepts of our way of life. But unlike our State Department, I'm not here to give anything away, as I have said. We're not going to, you probably heard recently that our State Department was extremely concerned because Mr. Khrushchev called up and said that he was threatening to discontinue the wheat deal unless our State Department would guarantee green stamps. Well, we are not going to give you any green stamps as you leave tonight. All we ask is that all of these fine people that have presented their various ideas here, most of them have written these in books and pamphlets, and we hope that you'll make use of this material and go home and see that it's distributed among more of your friends to help them become awakened. Now, the Communist Party of the United States has never been known to take a pulse reading or a survey to see if a given group, institution, or movement is agreeable to being taken over. They just go ahead and get the job done. They use cunning, long-range planning, patient manipulation, total amorality, and a coordinated strategy that becomes extremely ruthless. These are the weapons which the Communist Party and conspiracy uses against men and movements, institutions, to either capture and control these movements or institutions, or in some cases, destroy them. In the case of the civil rights movement, they intend to do both, and unfortunately are succeeding. The much publicized civil rights movement in the United States has been a main and well-perforated communist target since clear back in the 1920s. Yet, strangely enough, this clear reality has been ignored by the so-called penetrating depth surveys of the Harris or Gallup research organizations. Of course, those of us that live in California have found that they don't necessarily always know what they're talking about. Now, we believe that if these so-called research institutions, along with some of the others, like, say, the Rockefeller or Guggenheim or whatever the others are, would take time for even a cursory reading of the civil rights publications on the one hand, and well-identified communist publications on the other, such as The Worker in New York, The People's World in San Francisco, and apply a common-sense evaluation of this material to other obtainable information from our own government, they would come to the following inescapable conclusions regarding the civil rights movement. 1. The fomentation of conflict between the races in America has been a key program of the Communist Party of the United States for many years, and it is today its major domestic internal thrust. 2. The Communist Party of the United States, through its members and members of its various front groups, has had a heavy influence and exerted a decisive leadership in the conduct of the so-called civil rights movement, and it continues to provide that decisive leadership right now. 3. The strategy of the Communist Party of the United States is to establish a climate of terror and distrust between the races by promoting physical conflict and outright civil disobedience in this country. 4. The Communist Party of the United States seeks to utilize this climate of terror to attain federal intervention by force into state and local governmental affairs and to achieve passage, which it has now done, of unconstitutional legislation fraudulently called the Civil Rights Act of 1963 for the ostensible purpose of helping the Negroes, but for the real purpose of concentrating fantastic and unbelievable powers over individuals, organizations, and local governments within the executive branch of the federal government. 5. The concentration of such power in the federal government makes that government much more susceptible to the achievement of the ultimate objective of the Communist Party of the United States and its allies, that is, the internal seizure of this country if they can accomplish it without firing a shot. 6. The realistic, legitimate objectives of the Negroes and or any other minority group can and must be achieved by means other than those recommended by the Communist Party, its sympathizers, or those willing to act as its transmission belts. These, I am sure, many will consider startling statements. And if Gordon Hall is still here, I suppose he won't believe it. By the way, I hope he is, because I was nice enough to sit through one of his meetings one night in La Puente, California. And I'll be honest with you, I'll have a lot more facts to discuss than he'll ever discuss in a lifetime. Is he still here? Well, if he's outside, bring him in. I know he's been wandering in and out. I'd like him to hear this talk. I sat through one of his, and I think that's the least he can do. If he comes, okay, if he comes in, we'll let you know. I'm sure he'll have something to say. Now, I am sure that these statements that I have just made, these conclusions that I honestly believe, and many others do too, will seem a little strange to some people. But let me assure you, they are factual. And people say, my goodness, why haven't our newspapers told us about this? I haven't read this, for instance, in the New York Times or the Boston Globe. Well, no, please, no hysteria. I am sure that as the result of this speech, that tomorrow this is going to be on the front pages of all your Boston papers. Don't you imagine? So people say, can you prove it? Let me try. First of all, the communist emphasis on race agitation in America is not new. It has been dealt with at great length in many publications, such as the publications that have displays here in this particular gathering today. In many of the government investigations conducted by the Congress and the Senate of the United States, by the House of Representatives and the Senate, and by many state legislatures, these points can be clearly substantiated. For instance, as a result of a raid on the Communist Party in Bridgman, Michigan, clear back in 1922, Americans were first made aware of a secret Moscow directive signed by the Executive Committee of the Communist Party International. It was entitled Concerning the Next Tasks of the Communist Party of America. The directive was carefully marked, not for publication. In this document, the communists were instructed to utilize the Negro mass movement for racial betterment and agitation as an auxiliary force in class warfare. End of quote. In October of 1925, the Communist Party organized the National Negro Labor Congress in an effort to obtain Negro recruits into the Communist Party and/or also white recruits. 6 years later, a report, the House of Representatives, a special committee to investigate communist activities, entitled Investigation of Communist Propaganda. This report described the communist campaign to enlist the support of the Negro in these activities. I want to make one thing clear: they were not trying to recruit just the Negro. They were recruiting many other people. But this relates to this whole problem of the penetration of communists or communist sympathizers into the civil rights movement. This report said, quote, and I hope you will excuse me if I give you so many quotes this afternoon, but you must remember, that's why I'm hoping that Gordon Hall will get back so he can take extensive notes, that those of us in the so-called conservative or right-wing movements are always accused of being general and not documenting our case. And so if any of our good liberal friends are here today, I hope you will take extensive notes, because this can be documented, and we do know that these conclusions are right. At every opportunity, said this government report, the attempt is made to stir up trouble between the white and Negro races. In fact, there can be no doubt that the aim of the communists is to create a powerful proletarian movement which will fight and lead the struggle of the Negro race against so-called exploitation and oppression in every form, and thereby further the cause of the world revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat. End of quote. Now, in 1932, William Z. Foster, then chairman of the Communist Party, so I guess it's safe to call him a communist, he published a book called Toward a Soviet America. In this book, Foster set forth the blueprint for the communist influence, infiltration, and leadership of the so-called civil rights movement. By the way, how many in this audience have ever read Toward a Soviet America? Well, that's much better than the average audience. I hope you will read it, because it clearly outlines many of the things that are happening today. For instance, in this book, Toward a Soviet America, William Z. Foster outlined what he called a national legislative program for the Communist Party. If you will read that legislative program in Toward a Soviet America, you will be amazed to find that 70% of the recommendations of William Z. Foster, chairman of the Communist Party, have been enacted into law by your Congress. Now, does that make our Congress communist? Not at all. But as J. Edgar Hoover says, this is the success of the Communist Party in getting non-communists to build a communist America. Now, in this book, Toward a Soviet America, William Z. Foster said, the Communist Party actively promotes organizations to defend the right of Negroes. Where no mass organizations exist in these fields, the party takes the initiative in forming them. Where such are already in existence and are headed by conservative officials, and and of course a conservative official to a communist is anyone who opposes communism, the Communist Party follows the policy of building an opposition within them and fighting for the revolutionary program and leadership. This is the so-called boring from within policy. Now, at the 1959 convention of the Communist Party of the United States, to bring this more up to date, they said in a resolution on what they called the Negro question, quote, "A central task of the progressive forces within the Negro people's movement is to aid in the promotion of a recognition of the inseparability of the struggle for world peace to the realization of necessary objective circumstances favorable to the triumph in the cause of Negro freedom." We will see later on what they really mean by Negro freedom. "The foes of world peace," said the communists, "and the oppressors of the Negro people have a common class root, the elimination of monopoly capitalism and imperialism. A common bond of interests links the fighters for peace and the fighters for the democratic rights of the Negro people." Now, when we boil all this communist jargon down, what they are saying is, in their fight for world peace, and to a communist world peace comes when everybody lives under communism. In their fight for world peace, the communists are telling themselves in this country and abroad, a key factor to their success in attaining world peace or world communism is the inseparability of their movement from what they call the Negro freedom movement. This is a key program of the Communist Party, and this is how they say it. Now, a lead editorial called Peace and Civil Rights in the July 1963 edition of Political Affairs, a communist publication out of New York. Its masthead says the theoretical organ of the Communist Party of the United States. So again, I assume it's safe to call it a communist publication. In this editorial, Peace and Civil Rights by Hyman Loomer, the communists say, quote, this is 1963, "The key to the future in fighting both for peace and civil rights," and notice how they link these together, "clearly lies in the strengthening and the advancement of the mass movements and struggles. In fact, both the possibility and the need of setting masses in motion now exists as never before. In this connection, the fight for Negro freedom has become the focal point which at this juncture holds the key to all other struggles, including the fight for peace. What is demanded, therefore, is that all progressive and left forces, and especially all communists, throw themselves fully into the battles which lie ahead on this front." Now, we don't even need to make the normal transposition of the word peace into international communism in these particular quotations I have given you to gauge the tremendous importance which the communists themselves have assigned to what they call the civil rights battlefield. Now, in the August 1963 edition of Political Affairs, in an article by Benjamin J. Davis, a well-known Negro who is Secretary of the Communist Party of the United States, we get a very clear evidence of why the communists are really interested in penetrating the civil rights movement. Mr. Davis says, quote, "The communists hold that the race crisis, is the central domestic issue before the country." And then he tells us why. "The Communist Party greets with boundless joy the present revolutionary freedom movement of the Negro people and will spare no sacrifice to help bring about its total victory now. The communists have never been interested in the Negro, although Martin Luther King will try to tell us they are. They have only been interested in creating a revolutionary movement which they can captivate and through the confusion use to their advantage." Now, the importance of civil rights strife to the communists and their intentions regarding the civil rights crisis are manifest in all of their writings through the years. But proof of communist intentions does not constitute automatically proof of their control or leadership in this movement. In criminal law, it is necessary that there be a joinder of a criminal act with the intent to commit that act in order for a crime to be proved. So it is not enough for me to stand here today and say that the evidence is very clear that the communists have always intended to captivate the civil rights movement, but it becomes incumbent upon us to provide sufficient evidence for reasonable men to conclude that the Communist Party, through its agents, its various front groups, has sufficiently saturated the civil rights movement to be able to exercise decisive leadership, or to put it another way, be able to call the shots whenever they want to. Now, a district attorney cannot always be so hopeful or fortunate to have defendants confess their crimes. So it is here. We must rely on a preponderance of evidence, rational judgment, and common sense. You know, communists don't usually come down to the front of the room in a meeting and say, "Friends, us communists are here to take you over." They don't operate that way. They work under a total guise of deceit. You remember we even had a president of the United States claiming that Alger Hiss was not a communist, even when the record was very clear on the man, and J. Edgar Hoover knew it and had the information. Many others did. This shows the effect that the communists have in gaining high places without anybody except a few really knowing their true background. The point that I'm making is that we cannot hope for absolute proof of guilt. We can't see everybody's communist card, and some of them don't carry cards. For instance, I've never seen Khrushchev's card, but I think he's a communist. And the point we're making is we can look at the record and see what the case may be. Now, I want to make one thing clear as we go through this. I didn't make this record. These people made the records themselves. Let us begin with the most prominent organization in the so-called civil rights fight, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. On July 29, 1963, Congressman Gaddings presented in the Congressional Record information from the files of the House Committee on Un-American Activities relating to 59 top officers, members of the Board of Directors, legal, and other committees of the NAACP, as well as to certain members of the executive paid staff. Now, between these 59 leaders, these weren't just normal members, these were the national leaders of the NAACP. Among these 59 leaders, they had among them more than 450 identifiable communist fronts. What do we mean by identifiable communist front? One clearly identified by the Attorney General of the United States. Roy Wilkins, Executive Secretary, has belonged to 7 identifiable communist fronts. A. Philip Randolph, President of the AFL-CIO Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which incidentally is discriminatory. They won't allow white men in their group. Chairman of the August 28th March on Washington and National Vice President of the NAACP, has belonged to 20 identifiable communist fronts. John Hayes Holmes, the National Vice President of the NAACP, has belonged to 30. Algernon Black has belonged to 60. And we could go on and on and on. Mrs. Roosevelt, up until her passing, was a National Vice President of the NAACP, and she belonged to 82 identifiable communist fronts. Of course, you understand in her case it was just bad judgment. Now, a founder and a key leader of the NAACP was W.E.B. Du Bois, who recently passed away the day before the March on Washington. During his lifetime, he belonged to 96 identifiable communist fronts. He received the Lenin Peace Prize in 1959, which some of us don't consider a free world presentation. He culminated his lifelong support. Now remember, this was a man that was not only a major founder of the NAACP, but was one of its longtime officers. He held a press conference in 1961 and said he wanted to make it official that he had been a communist most of his adult life. He then went to Africa to help the advance of Marxism. Now let's bring that a little more up to date. Even after that, in 1963, during the so-called March on Washington, 7 basic leaders of the civil rights movement stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and praised W.E. Du Bois as one of the greatest leaders of the civil rights movement. And this was a full 2 years after he had clearly identified himself as a known communist. Now, it's hard for us to believe that all of those people were naive. In addition to that, a rally was held in Madison Square Garden in February of this year, a memorial tribute to W.E. Du Bois. One of the sponsors was the Communist Party of the United States. And one of the major sponsors to the so-called memorial tribute to W.E. Du Bois, now remember, a major leader of the civil rights movement, was Senator Jacob Javits of New York, who has had the unmitigated gall to go around this country and claim that Senator Goldwater isn't in the mainstream of American thinking. Now, the Communist journal Political Affairs for January of 1956 clearly indicated red control in the NAACP when it said, quote, "It is time, comrades, that we salute the heroic leadership which the NAACP is giving this far-flung struggle in the heartland of Dixiecrat racism. The NAACP in the South this is the communist talking, the NAACP in the South is leading a struggle against an implacable and ruthless enemy. We must support the NAACP in this struggle with every ounce of energy at our disposal." End of quote. I always am a little bit amused at the communists when they have the gall to speak of the people in our southern states as an implacable and ruthless enemy. When they murder, they lie, they cheat, and they have the gall to come to this country and try to pit American against American by making people in this country believe that the people in the South are somehow different than the rest of America, which of course they're not. Now, I don't think it's necessary to say, and it's amazing how many pick up that line, including the New York Times. Now, I don't think it's necessary that we say that the Communist Party does not salute that which it does not either manipulate or somehow control. Perhaps the major civil rights activity of 1963 was the highly touted March on Washington, D.C. It was actually managed by its deputy director, Bayard Rustin. Now, among Mr. Rustin's many accomplishments, if you want to call them that, Mr. Rustin was a member of the Young Communist League at the College of the City of New York in 1936. He served on its staff after he left the school, organizing Young Communist Leagues all over the country. He was Race Relations Director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which is not a communist front or has not been declared as one, but actually has cooperated with many, many other known communist fronts. He was a so-called impartial observer at the Communist Party of the United States' 16th Annual Convention in 1957. Rustin served as field secretary for the Congress on Racial Equality, which we'll cover later, and in the early 1940s and during the same period spent 28 months in jail for draft evasion. And the reason he gave that he didn't want to serve his country is he said that his country hadn't treated him very well, and so he didn't feel that he could serve in fighting for the country. He also served as Martin Luther King Jr. Secretary in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which we'll cover in a moment. On top of all of this, Rustin was convicted of sex perversion in Pasadena, California in 1953. Interestingly enough, when he was found in the car with two other gentlemen engaged in very dubious activities, he had just preached a sermon at a local church. Now, Mr. Rustin, none of these facts caused any apparent concern to A. Philip Randolph, who was the March director and incidentally had 20 communist fronts to his credit. Because Mr. Randolph, upon being questioned about Mr. Rustin's rather dubious background, I knew he'd never hear one of my speeches. What would we do if we didn't have a Gordon Hall? Huh? Mr. A. Philip Randolph, who was the March director, upon being questioned rather thoroughly by the press one day as to why he had selected a man such as Mr. Rustin to be one of the major leaders of this civil rights march, this is what Mr. Randolph said, quote, "Why, he's Mr. March himself. We couldn't do without him. His outstanding ability and experience are invaluable." Now, the question some of us have is just which part of this experience he's referring to. His conviction for sex perversion in Pasadena, California, his activity in the Young Communist League, his activity in many times going to taking pilgrimages to communist countries, his activity at communist conventions, just which part of this so equipped Mr. Rustin to be a major leader of this major march on our national capital. Now, another key organization in the civil rights picture is the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. What kind of men has he selected to be around him? Well, the National Secretary of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference is the Reverend Fred L. Shuttlesworth. Mr. Shuttlesworth is also the new president of the Southern Conference Educational Fund. This organization, which Mr. Shuttlesworth heads, has been declared by both the House Committee on Un-American Activities, after clear documentation, and the Internal Security Committee of the Senate to be a known identified major communist organ in the South. In addition to that, he selected to be around him on his board of directors at one time Carl Braden of Kentucky, who is a known communist. He also selected the program director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference is the Reverend Andrew Young, who received his training at the Highlander Folk School, which was declared by a joint committee of the Tennessee legislature as, quote, a meeting place for known communists or fellow travelers. As a matter of fact, the school was so bad they finally banned it from the state. Now, the Highlander Folk School on Labor Day 1957 had an interesting array of faculty members. At that particular time, Miles Horton, director of the school, who has a notorious background of communist activity, Aubrey Williams, president of the Southern Christian Educational Fund, declared to be a known communist front, and he was president at that time. Abner W. Berry was also a faculty member, a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the United States. Now, of course, the other gentleman teaching was Martin Luther King, and he taught in that particular session, he taught how to lead street demonstrations. Now, among other of Martin Luther King's activities, he has joined with the International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers, which was declared communist-dominated on several occasions by the United States Subversive Activity Control Board. Carl Prussian, a former operative for the FBI and the Communist Party, reports that he attended Santa Clara County, California, Communist Party meetings from 1954 to 1959. At these meetings, a man by the name of Ed Beck, known to Prussian to be the communist cell leader, presided. By the way, it's interesting to note that Ed Beck is today the secretary of the NAACP in San Mateo County, California. Now, at these particular meetings during this period of time, the following directive was many times presented to other communists. It said, quote, all communists working within the framework of the NAACP are instructed to work for a change of the passive attitude of the NAACP toward a more militant, demonstrative class struggle policy to be expressed in sit-ins, demonstrations, marches, and protests for the purpose of transforming the NAACP into an organization for the achievement of communist objectives. Now, at these meetings, Carl Prussian reports that the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was always set forth as the individual to whom the communists should look and rally around in what the communists called their struggle on the racial issues. Now, all of this information is in the files of the Attorney General of the United States, and I'm sure he'll release them to the papers tomorrow. Don't you imagine? Now, another of the leading so-called organizations in the civil rights fight, and we couldn't go through all of the officers of this organization, is the Congress of Racial Equality, known as CORE. Among its top 50 major leaders, they have belonged to well over 500 identifiable communist fronts. Now, probably the most active in this group is the national director, James Farmer, who you read about in the New York Times and the Washington Post all the time. An investigating committee of the House of Representatives of Texas in 1961 said that in addition to Farmer's very active participation in many known communist fronts, that he has been on the national board of the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy and has also served as the field secretary for the Student League for Industrial Democracy, known as SLID. The SLID publication the SLID organization puts out a publication called Revolt. In this publication, Farmer has written for it many times, and we can get a clear insight as to his general confused thinking by reading his own quotes. He says, quote, the League for Industrial Democracy is a militant educational movement which challenges those who would think and act for a new social order based on production for use and not for profit. And of course, Mr. Farmer says he realizes that this is very similar to Mr. Marx's theory. He says this is a revolutionary slogan. It means that our members think and work for the elimination of capitalism and the substitution of a new order. End of quote. Now, two other gentlemen, and we could talk all night about CORE because it's so heavily penetrated, but there's two other gentlemen that are very key in the civil rights so-called fight. Walter Reuther and his brother Victor Reuther. Now, these two gentlemen Victor Reuther is very active in the finance activities of the National Council of Churches. And for those of you who have great feeling for this organization, I hope you'll look into it, because you'll find that unfortunately Victor Reuther has had far more bad influence in the group than he's had good. And that Walter Reuther, of course, uses the funds of many organizations to stimulate all kinds of agitation around this country. Both of these men helped participate in the March on Washington. They've participated in sending many students under so-called grants to southern states and other places to stir up agitation. What kind of background do these men have? And I know that this has been discussed before, but I think that we of course would like our newspapers and community, say Huntley Brinkley, to do an expose on this sometime. That we feel that these two gentlemen have never deviated from the basic purpose that they set out in their own writing some time ago. As a matter of fact, John L. Lewis once said of Walter Reuther is an earnest Marxist, chronically inebriated, I think, by the exuberance of his verbosity. But I think the most telling thing about Walter and Victor Reuther and their real intentions in the civil rights movement is contained in a letter which they wrote when they were attending communist labor schools in Moscow on January 20th, 1934. They wrote this letter to Melvin and Gladys Bishop. It was clearly documented before the House, one of the committees of Congress, then the Dies Committee. It was clearly documented even by Gladys and Melvin Bishop. And further, Walter Reuther admitted at one time on Edward R. Murrow's program that he had written the letter. Walter and Victor Reuther wrote from communist Russia in 1934, quote, "We are witnessing and experiencing great things in the unions of Soviet Socialist republics. We urge you to carry on the fight for a Soviet America." Today, Walter Reuther will tell you that he is working for a socialist America. But of course, those of us who have studied his life know that he devotes a great deal of his energy, not only in the national civil rights activity, and Victor Reuther in the National Council of Churches, but that they also devote a great deal of their time to not only socializing, but converting this country to a Soviet America. I don't think they've changed their purposes and basic ideals one bit, and I think that the more we discuss this, the more the American people will see many of the things they are doing. Now, recently, to give this even more present emphasis, Paul Scott, a nationally syndicated Washington columnist, said in his Alan Scott report and this was as a result of an address before several newspaper editors in Washington on April 16, 1964. He said, quote, "The civil rights movement in the United States has been clearly infiltrated in top levels by known communists and is being financed by international communism. He predicted that in the next few months, racial demonstrations will bring violence and bloodshed throughout the country. He told the editors that he sees a very bad picture for the immediate future in our country. And he based this on information that he has received from known sources within the administrative branch of the government." So we could continue to making references to other highly placed leaders in the civil rights movement who have either had extensive, identified Communist Front activity or have actually participated in the Communist Party itself. This, I contend, would only produce what the communists call overkill. Now, we have thus far discussed the emphasis which the Communist Party of the United States has placed upon the domestic civil rights controversy. And especially, we have discussed the extensive leadership positions held by its agents or those who are willing to cooperate with it. The editorial from the communist publication Political Affairs, I think, gives us a clear indication of what their immediate strategy is. They said, quote, "It is necessary first to mobilize all possible support for the administration's civil rights legislation." And they made this statement a clear 6 months even before Jack Kennedy knew he was going to get a bill. "Its passage," say the communists, "will place the role of the federal government in a new light and will thus constitute a major advance. But it will not occur without an all-out fight. Legislation is no substitute for direct federal intervention in the South, including the use of federal troops. What is called for are bigger demonstrations, and especially a mass outpouring on the March on Washington planned for August 28th, such as has never before been witnessed." Now remember, this was a clear 6 months before it happened. It is essential to fight for greater unity and coordination within the movement itself as a necessary condition for advance and to relate other movements and struggles with it. So here it is, very clearly blueprinted by the communists themselves. Passage of the civil rights legislation which they have just 2 days ago achieved. Mass demonstrations. This is part of their strategy. And more important to the communists, unification under communist leadership. Now we know that the communists do not advocate these policies because they really want to help the Negro. As a matter of fact, they could care less about the Negro or the Chinese, the Indians, or the white man. We have adequate testimony on this. And so the next time you hear or see your local newspaper trying to make you believe that various leaders are telling us, well, like Martin Luther King, who said over and over, oh yes, he would take help from the Communist Party. He would take help from anybody who gave him support. That doesn't help anybody when they do that. And when you see your local newspapers doing this, make sure this is corrected, because it is a false impression that is constantly pushed. Well, after all, when you're in a cause, you got to take help from any place you get it. And can't you imagine, for instance, a local parent group having somebody like John Dillinger come in to teach their children the other side of crime? It's unheard of. But this is exactly the basic same type of thinking, fuzzy thinking, by some of these people that I'm sure are well-meaning, others that aren't, that believe they can accept support from the Communist Party and that will be helpful to the Negro. It won't be. Now, Joseph Cornfetter said, before a legislative committee on March 7, 1957, a former communist, he said, quote, "The communists aim to use the Negro, preach a doctrine of racial nationalism in order to use the Negro for their purposes. Once they have used him, they will do with the Negro what they have done in Russia with the peasant and the working man." Leonard Patterson, a Negro and former communist, taken before a legislative committee on November 18, 1959, stated almost the same thing. But I think his statement should be a ringing reminder to all Americans. The communists don't have the goodwill of American Negro in mind. He said, quote, "I left the Communist Party because I became convinced that the Communist Party did not have at heart the interest of the Negro people, the interest of the white people, the interest of the laboring people. That the Communist Party was only interested in promoting among the Negro people a national so-called liberation movement that would in fact aid the Communist Party in its efforts to create a proletarian revolution in the United States that would overthrow the government by force and violence through either a bloody full-time revolution and or substitute it with a Soviet form of government with a dictatorship of the proletariat." Now, J. Edgar Hoover has tried to warn us on this same subject many times. He said, quote, January 16, 58, "The Communist Party's objectives are not to aid the Negroes, but are designed to take advantage of all of the controversial issues on the race question so as to create the unrest, the dissension, and the confusion in the minds of the American people." J. Edgar Hoover said on January 29th of this year, before a congressional hearing, which, by the way, the testimony to be printed, the administration worked very aggressively to try to prevent the printing of this testimony until after the election. J. Edgar Hoover said, "Communist influence does exist in the Negro movement and could play an important role in swaying masses without their realizing it. We do know," said Mr. Hoover, "that communist influence does exist in the Negro movement, and it is this influence which is vitally important. Therefore, the communists must see in the civil rights legislation, in the massive use of federal troops, in massive demonstrations, and in their program of unification under communist leadership, a means of advancing their own influence and control over all Americans, or they wouldn't waste their time penetrating the movements in the first place." Now, what about this so-called civil rights legislation that has just been passed by the Congress and signed by our President? Well, let's take what responsible people have said about this bill and then what the communists have said about it and why they were so interested in it. And they made no bones about it. They were public, extremely public in their complete advocacy of this bill because they said it would help advance their cause. Two past presidents of the American Bar Association, one of them Lloyd Wright of California, said that this bill that has just been passed and is now a law is about 10% civil rights and 90% massive extension of federal executive power. They said that if this legislation becomes law and is upheld by the courts, it will in fact extend federal control over business, industry, and over individuals, with a corresponding destruction of local governmental powers and individual rights. It will in fact destroy the constitutional checks and balances between the federal governments and the states. They conclude by saying, the civil rights aspects of this legislation are but a cloak, uncontrolled federal executive power. Now, what do the communists say of this bill? Clyde Lightfoot, Secretary of the Communist Party in Illinois, has made it very clear why the communists were so active to have this bill passed. They said, quote, "This legislation is important to the Communist Party. The structure of our form of government is a tremendous obstacle to any rapid advance. Our government is divided into three power structures," said Communist Lightfoot: legislative, judicial, and executive. All three branches have certain powers which enable a canceling out process. This so-called equal distribution of power, said Mr. Lightfoot, is nothing more than a built-in safeguard for reactionary policies. The communists are only interested in this legislation because it breaks down our constitutional freedoms, because it concentrates tremendous powers in the central government which evidently they feel they control. Is it any wonder, then, that Hyman Loomer said, editor of Political Affairs, "This bill will place the role of the federal government in a new light and will thus constitute a major advance." Benjamin J. Davis, Secretary of the National Communist Party, even went further. He said, "Communists believe that the achievement of this program will lay an indispensable basis not only for the further social progress of the country, but for its socialist and communist future." Now, how many more bugle calls do we need as American people to know that our Congress has just passed a basic plank of the Communist Party of the United States? So it seems apparent that the communist strategy now calls for the use of racial agitation and conflict as a cause through which the concentration of power in the federal government, which evidently they feel they can more easily manipulate, may be obtained for their cause. This is, of course, a much more sophisticated and therefore more dangerous approach than their original push in the 20s to convert the southern states into Negro Soviet republics. Therefore, America faces the necessity of making some rather important decisions, a fact that is understood by too few of our legislators, let alone our citizenry. The question is whether we will allow ourselves to be sucked in by the siren songs of the communist so-called programs of civil rights, or whether we shall recognize that in any quest for really helping any group in this country, we cannot destroy other people's freedoms. What can we do? Well, I am sure you have heard many things this weekend that we can all do, especially in this civil rights program, to reverse the direction that the socialists, the communists, and the other collectivists would like to take us in this country. But there are some specific things that I'm sure you know that we can do. I'd like to enumerate a few, but we must aggressively pursue these. First, it is important that we not unfairly place the blame for much of this agitation upon the Negro on the one hand, or the so-called segregationist on the other, whatever that is, it hasn't been fully defined. and place it where it properly belongs, on the shoulders of the Communist Party, which aggressively pursues its course of promoting race hatred, race conflict, and as J. Edgar Hoover says, confusion. Understanding and genuine tolerance of the Negro's desire for improved status will never be achieved by following deceitful communist programs of agitation or so-called civil rights. Ultimate communist purposes are never what they seem to be on the surface, as I'm sure the farmers in China can tell you who followed Mao Zedong's program of agrarian reform, or the people in Cuba can tell you today, those who followed Mr. Castro's program of land reform. When enough Americans realize that the overwhelming proportion of improper civil rights agitation is manipulated from behind the scenes by communist sympathizers and fellow travelers, we can truly approach the problems of all of our minority citizens, whoever they may be, with a far better sense of rationale and genuine judgment. We can also then achieve real progress on a voluntary basis without federal compulsion. Second, and we'll have to see that this area of our community wakes up and does something about this, those barriers of formal segregation that have already been eliminated, and more important, the greatly improved status of the Negro in this country, should be more widely declared and made known by all segments of our press. Why? Because by having the knowledge of these two important areas of achievement better known, the improper sense of discontent and racial agitation can be more properly minimized. The proper needs of the Negro, like any other group, will receive enlightened attention rather than street demonstration attention. Now, let me be a little more specific. And this is where our communication media have fallen down miserably. Right here in New England, too, where it's supposed to be the heartland of civil rights. There are 20 million Negroes in this country, and these are only a few of the measuring sticks. These 20 million Negroes in this country, who are Americans first and Negroes second, have a combined wealth that is 5 times as great as all the rest of the Negro population of the world. There are more doctors. There are more dentists. There are more architects. There are more people in the political field in this country than most other countries in the world. There are more Negroes attending schools, public schools, private schools in this country than most other countries of the world, including that great place of freedom, France, or England, or the ones that always yell about our improper attitudes here. Now, why can't these areas of achievement also be discussed in our publications rather than constantly telling us that the Negro is 100 years behind everybody else, which he is not? That is unfair. Now, it is this improper sense of discontent which is constantly stirred by Huntley and Brinkley and the rest of the claque that causes part of the problem. And we have a responsibility where we are to see that our communication media play up the progress, the achievement that is being made, as well as those areas of discontent. Third, I think we should listen to the voice of the strong, patriotic, reasonable Negroes among us. We've heard many of them. But there is a Negro attorney in New York who is running for state senate, who wrote an article for the Hearst publications. Her name is Cora Walker. I've never met her, but her words make sense. She said, progress, freedom, and equality cannot be given or conferred upon any group of people. The group progresses when the whole group moves ahead. Are we Negroes striving to make our communities livable? Are we bent on using our resources to create jobs and other opportunities for our youth? Or are we looking to and begging others for those things? Now, the overwhelming proportion of our wonderful Negro population aren't looking to Lyndon Johnson or Mrs. Johnson, who hasn't done a very good job in her own claim, for leadership. They aren't looking for the federal government to do this for them. They want to do it on their own. And she says, Cora Walker, it should be made clear that many of our problems are self-inflicted and that any meaningful progress must come from the Negro himself. Now, the Negroes know this. The Negroes themselves, the overwhelming majority of them, know this. But it is our publications that improperly distort the works of Martin Luther King, or like Yale University giving an honorary degree to Martin Luther King, who no more deserves that kind of recognition for all the kind of agitation he has stirred in this country, because they do not actually look to the Negro or any other American to do it for himself, which is the basic thesis of our country. Fourth, we should encourage all Negro people we know, and all Americans, to approach these problems on the basis of self-improvement, self-education. I think that James Hood, the first male Negro to enroll at the University of Alabama, stated it properly for all Americans when he said, "Why doesn't the Negro race wake up and go about this thing in a more intelligent way? Who benefits from the conflict, the Negro masses or the Negro leaders? There must be more time spent in the classrooms and less time wasted on the picket lines. I think it has become a matter of unnecessary excitement rather than conviction for some Negroes." Fifth, we should give specific support to those institutions and organizations that do treat all Americans on a fair basis. But we must remember that there's another important civil right, if you want to call it that, or a very important given right under our Constitution that we have inherently, and that is the right of property. Now, the right of property carries with it the right to be selective. And the right to be selective is the right to choose. And the right to choose is the essence of liberty. It is before the law that men are equal. You can't make them equal by law. Now, if our socialist and leftist friends were so correct about this thesis of tearing down private property to make somebody else's property better, which is incorrect, then we could probably say, well, then in the field of education, we must have equality. So what we'll do from now on is we'll take all students, and it's desirable for everybody to get a C. So we'll take from the student who makes an A and give part of his grade to the man who makes an F, so everybody can get a C. Oh, they'd say, this is terrible. But it's the same basic concept. When you destroy or take away another man's property that is inherently his, to give to another, as our government so often does, you are destroying the essence of liberty. Manning Johnson, in his book, Color, Communism, and Common Sense, makes a wonderful appeal to all Americans to approach this problem on the basis of self-improvement and self-education. And I know this book is available, and I hope that you will get it and distribute it to your friends, because it clearly outlines the very problems that we are having in this country today. This is a man who served in the Communist Party, defected from it because he found it was nothing but a deceit and a treachery to wake up the American people to what is occurring in the civil rights field. Won't you get this book and distribute it? It's one of the finest I've ever read, and it clearly outlines how we as individuals can make better use of the concept of self-education. People say, well, what are you going to do for all these people that don't have civil rights? Well, the question implies that they don't have civil rights. They do. It also implies that we have to help somebody else who can't help themselves, and nobody in America really wants that, and especially not the federal government to do it for them. Sixth, This country was based on the concept that there is a God. That is one of the reasons we're here today. Now that God is available to everyone, and our founding fathers knew that only so well. The concepts of spiritual values can be the greatest help to anyone: Negro, Indian, Chinese. Now the government can't guarantee that for you. It's an individual thing. And I think this whole concept of use of spiritual values and its importance in all of our lives is best summarized in a little item called One Solitary Life, and probably summarizes the importance of our individual spiritual participation in creating this enlightened atmosphere of morality that Tom Anderson spoke of so eloquently today. This little item goes: he was born in an obscure village. He grew up in still another village where he worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30. Then for 3 years he was a preacher. He didn't write a major book except through others. He never held a so-called public office. He didn't go to the kind of colleges we have today. He did none of the things one usually associates with greatness. He had no credentials but himself and those God gave him. He was only 33 when the tide of public opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. He was turned over to his enemies and went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed to a cross between two thieves. While he was dying, his executioners gambled for his clothing. When he passed away, he was laid in a grave through the help of a friend. 19 centuries have come and gone, and today he is a central figure of the human race and a leader of mankind's progress. All the armies that ever marched, all the navies that ever sailed, all the parliaments that ever sat, put together, have not affected the life of man on this earth as much as that one solitary life. Now the lesson in this for us, as it relates to civil rights: every individual has an important spiritual contribution to make to this country. Oh, you'll be controversial if you try to bring these concepts, especially to the civil rights battlefield. But I mentioned this as the last point of what we can do because it so beautifully ties in, too, with what Tom Anderson said. The moral breakdown in this country because of a degeneration of spiritual values has helped and aided the Communist Party. Because those who believe in spiritual values have been unwilling or too busy to do anything about bringing those concepts to public life or to the civil rights battlefield. Now, the overwhelming majority of American people have a great deal of sympathy and far better genuine respect for the Negro, not because he's a Negro, but because he is first an American. And also for the other minority people in the United States who are trying to genuinely better their lot. But let us not be stampeded, as we have been so many times in the past, by a communist-created crisis, or especially by communist-created solutions which never bring positive results for anyone but the communists. Thank you very much.